The Unitarian Church in Quincy, Illinois is proud to present the following talk, titled Upending the Church for Love by our minister, CHARLEY EARP. This talk was originally presented on Sunday, March 21st at 10:30 a.m. and was recorded live via Zoom. On this post, there is a video, which it is highly recommended you watch prior to listening to this recording, as the recording does heavily rely on the topics discussed within the video.
Hang on, I'm having a moment. I've heard that story dozens of times, and it always just gets me right here. Just, I gave this sermon the title, Upending the Church for Love. And I don't know what I'm doing. I'm off the rails of what I understand ministry to be. Although it is what I dreamed of ministry being, but I don't know how to get where I want to go, where I imagine we can go. I don't have a roadmap. I have befriended Rebecca a few years ago when she was just starting the Gilead Church, and I was there that night during that karaoke church service, and I did hear the DJ talk about feeling blessed, but also how the church he left behind is still trying to tell him he's going to hell. The church I left behind, the religious family that I left behind, and I'm not gay, I just simply could no longer live with a church that told me there was a wrathful God up in heaven watching every little move I made to make sure I was following some infallible book that was written thousands of years ago. I could no longer live with that story. I could no longer live with that theology. And I walked away, a preacher's kid, 4 generations of Pentecostals in my family, and I walked away from it, and I am still considered by my own brother to be the black sheep in my own family. But somewhere along the way, I discovered the power of radical universal love. And it changed everything. It changed everything. I could no longer view the world through a lens that said there's a bunch of people who are bad and there's a tiny little group of people who are good and everybody else is just doomed. And I began my own quest for a church of love, a church of radical, inclusive, open-hearted love. If I can try to trace where it began for me, I often tell the story of when I was in probably what we might have said was the 7th grade, 1975. My parents, for some odd reason, even though they were Pentecostal, fundamentalists, pretty conservative, had put me, we were living in Chicago at the time, and my father was pastoring a church in a Puerto Rican neighborhood that was made up of only white folks. There were no people of color, people who weren't white attending this church, and so it was a fairly small congregation in the Humboldt Park neighborhood of Chicago. And the public schools in Chicago are a mixed bag. They're underfunded, they're overcrowded. And I was being bullied a lot as a kid because I was from a small town. I had lived the previous 4 years in Bushnell, Illinois, not too far, a little over an hour from Quincy there, a town of 3,000. But even there, I got bullied because I was a preacher's kid, because I was a bit too vulnerable and unwilling to defend myself. I just let them do what they did. So my parents started looking for a different school, and I ended up in a magnet school. A magnet school draws from the entire northern side of Chicago and is racially balanced intentionally, which means they do a lottery. So to even get into the school, I had to literally win the lottery. My classmates went from being a majority white group there in the school that I had been when we first moved to Chicago to a school that was racially balanced, where a third of the students were African American, a third of them were Hispanic or Asian American, and then a third of them were Caucasian or white, like me. And the 2 years that I was at that school, I unlearned what I had been unconsciously imprinted on my mind by going to almost entirely all white schools for all the previous years. I learned about Black culture. I learned about Latinx culture. I learned about the history of the United States in a way that it wasn't being taught in the mainstream schools. And on January 15th of 1976, there were a group of us students were gathered for an assembly, all the same age, around 7th grade, to listen to a speech on January 15th. Now, this was before there was a Martin Luther King holiday. So all of us kids, as I say, intentionally racially diverse. I had friends who were not white for the first time in my life in the 7th grade. And we're listening to this speech called the I Have a Dream speech by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I'd never heard this before. I knew who Dr. King was, sort of, but until I heard this recording of I Have a Dream, I didn't know who he was, and I didn't know the power behind his work in our world. And as I'm listening to this sermon, sorry, it's a speech. No, it was a sermon. This preacher's kid sitting there hearing this sermon for the first time, this wasn't a speech. This was a sermon. This was calling the entire United States to fulfill a divine vision of becoming inclusive, of eliminating all racial disparities within the United States and finding ourselves living in a beloved community together. Seventh grade kid, preacher's kid, listening to another preacher from another tradition. And it changed me. Everything about that school changed me. Encountering culture and people and ways of viewing the world that I had never encountered before in those 2 years at that magnet school. My parents took me out at the end of that year, put me in a private school, and I was in private schools for 2 years from 8th and 9th grade. And I hated it. And I couldn't really tell you why back then. I can now. I just knew that they were full of rules, and they had this same view of God who hated everybody who didn't follow all the rules and was going to punish them eternally. And from the seed, just like that, I began my path to becoming a Unitarian Universalist. And that's who the Unitarian Church of Quincy has invited to be their minister. You could have picked someone else. You picked me. I thank you for that. I thank you for the opportunity. And I don't have a roadmap. I don't know what I'm doing. This is my first time as a minister in a UU church. I've been an intern minister before, but now a lot is falling on me about how to minister effectively to the Unitarian Church of Quincy. And on top of that, we have the pandemic, which means I've never met any of you in person. And we're trying to figure out how I can get that shot so that I can come to Quincy, or maybe come to Quincy and get the shot. We're talking about that. So I want to back up from my story and begin to look a little at your story, the Unitarian Church of Quincy. Church has been around a long time in a somewhat unusual place for a Unitarian church to show up. Quincy has a reputation of its founding community being German Catholic. Not to pick on Catholics, I would never do that, but German Catholics are the ones who found Martin Luther to be too liberal, if that tells you anything. Because Martin Luther was not, and remember, Martin Luther is the namesake of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther was not a liberal. And yet the Catholics thought he was moving too fast and changing too many things in the church. That's the bedrock, if you will, of the white community within Quincy. But there is an older Quincy, or at least an older history than the German Catholic founding of the town of Quincy. And that's the indigenous people who have called the Quincy area their home before the white man came. We know some of their names. You know, the Sauk people, the Fox, the Kickapoo, the Illiniwek. All of those tribes have at one time or another considered the area of Quincy to be their homes. And as settlers moved from the east into the Midwest, they were driven out by war and by disease. And so we rest now on that land that was taken by colonialism and settler movement. And we cannot undo all that history. And to talk about creating a new vision within the Unitarian Church of Quincy that is racially diverse, that is culturally aware, that is historically aware, does not say we have to change everything. Obviously, a church of around 51 people, and we have more than 51 friends and neighbors of this church who are involved with us. Even all of that, we can't change all of Quincy. We can't undo the history of racism, the history of settler colonialism. We can't undo that history. And I hope no one thinks that I believe we can do that. And I also don't believe that everyone in the church has to become an activist. I think like an activist, but I'm actually really more of a dreamer, a visionary. I don't love mass demonstrations. I find them claustrophobic. I'm a bit of an introvert, and so I don't like marching in the streets. And yet sometimes, as Dr. King showed, we have to get over those inclinations and we have to march in the streets. But that's not what this vision of transforming the Quincy area, transforming the entire United States, which we're not doing alone. I explicitly put in our script today that we mentioned that we have churches all around the world that identify as Unitarian or Universalist or both. We have churches in the Philippines, we have churches in Australia, we have churches in Africa. Our movement is not just this little church. We are a part of a bigger association. And I believe that that association is called to participate in a movement that is changing the world, that is bigger than any of the individual churches. And so it's not so much about figuring out how we do things perfectly here. It's about connecting ourselves in our hearts and in our minds to a bigger, expansive vision of what Unitarian Universalism can become. Universalism was founded as a rejection of that doctrine of fall, of eternal hell, that was so pervasive in its time and is still pervasive in our time. I imagine that most of the churches in Quincy teach some version of the doctrine of eternal hell. There are a few. We know we have allied churches: the United Church of Christ, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. The Methodist Church may be a liberal church. Some Methodist churches are, who don't buy into that doctrine of eternal hell. But the religious right, which became ascendant here in the United States during the Trump administration, was also ascendant during the Bush and the Reagan administration. They do teach this doctrine that God doesn't love you truly. At least he loves you, but he offers you, a sacrificial death on a cross to forgive your sins. But if you don't come along and start towing the line, God's going to punish you forever. And I lived with that doctrine as a core piece of my theology for a long time. And when I finally realized it was hurting me, it was keeping me from loving people, I threw it away. And it was hard to throw it away because it's like Stockholm syndrome. My parents told me they loved me, but they also told me that God might burn me in hell forever. How do you teach a child something like that? And universalism as a religious movement began on the mission of eliminating that doctrine of eternal hell and an angry, wrathful God, and said, this just does not fit what we believe the truth is. And now, 200 years later, since universalism began to move within the world, we have a lot of allies within Christian churches. I already mentioned the United Church of Christ, parts of the United Methodist Church, Christian Church Disciples of Christ. They already are preaching a message of love, but they do still center Jesus of Nazareth in a way that Unitarian Universalism, for most of the past 70 years, maybe further back, 1930s is when humanism really became the dominant theology of Unitarian of Unitarians. It also became the dominant theology of the Universalists, which is why we were able to merge. Humanism really got its started in the 1930s with the Humanist Manifesto, and it pervaded the Unitarian and Universalist churches. But prior to that, the Unitarian and the Universalists were Christian churches. And so in an odd way, re-embracing the doctrine of universal love is a return to our roots, is a return to where the movement came from, because it did come out of Christianity. But it's not a return where we can allow the limitations of traditional Christianity to overwhelm and to negate the progress and the advance that we have made in the past century, past 90 years since humanism became more dominant. And then in the 80s, when plurality and diversity, and we began to have more pagan, more Buddhist, and other types. And we even now today, there are Muslims among Unitarian Universalists. And our universalism has become bigger than Christian universalism. And it's a unique and a special, beautiful theology in a world that is plagued by very negative theologies. And it is something that I believe more people would want if they knew it existed, because nobody came to me and said, I want you to check out universalism. I had to find it for myself. I had to dig into libraries to find out that there were people who didn't believe in an eternal hell, that there were people who believed in love as the most important human creation, that the ability of humans to create communities of love and care and support, that was far more important than this institution that taught you to fear for your eternal soul. So as we look at this question of upending the church in the name of love, which is basically standing on the shoulders of the Unitarian and Universalists before us, who said we want to create a religion of love rather than a religion of fear, we find ourselves also the inheritors of that settler colonial legacy that I spoke of. Quincy, situated on the banks of the Mississippi River, right next to Missouri, which was a slave state during the Civil War, and we have that legacy of slavery as well, even though Illinois has never been a slave state. We have nevertheless carried on in the spirit of that with practices of segregation, redlining, housing discrimination in various ways to keep the African American population in a marginal position, in a position of vulnerability to poverty, vulnerability to health care shortage. Average age of death in African American communities is lower than that of white communities, and it all traces back to economic. I apologize that I'm struggling for words here. It all traces back to economic deprivation. And again, I'm not saying that Unitarian Church of Quincy or even the Unitarian Universalist Association at large can change those conditions. What I am saying is that we can choose to be part of the broader, greater movement in the world for racial justice, for economic justice, for political justice, that I believe is the natural outcome of a doctrine of universal love. Because we believe in justice for all, not justice just for only our in-group. And that is what makes Unitarian Universalism distinctive in our world, is that we have that message of love, and we just need to believe in it, to lean into it, and to share it with our community, especially those who are on the margin of our community, and not only Black, Indigenous people of color, but definitely Black and Indigenous people of color, but also LGBTQ persons who are discriminated against every day by our society that holds if you're not straight and if you don't fit on the gender binary the right way, you're subhuman. What I love so much about Reverend Rebecca's Gilead Church is that they're the most queer church I've ever been to, and I know that word is probably not the best word for a straight guy like me to use, but queer is beautiful, and the way the Gilead Church lives into its solidarity with the LGBTQ community is just inspiring. And I believe that we could do similar things here in Quincy. So I'm going to ask you to take a moment, sit quietly with some of the things I've said. Think about where you are now, how you're connected to Quincy Church. Think about why you love the Unitarian Church of Quincy, why you keep coming back. Think about how you carry a message of radical love, concern for justice into the city of Quincy. Imagine what the city of Quincy would be if there were no Unitarian Church of Quincy. As small as it is, as unusual as the Unitarian Church of Quincy is in the city of Quincy and in Adams County and the tri-state area here, imagine if it hadn't been here at all for all those 100 years or more. And then think of the future, the next year, the next decade, as we come out of the pandemic. Imagine the Unitarian Church of Quincy becoming a church that will not only survive the next decade, not only thrive in the next decade, but become a real vector of a global movement for transformation for Black, Indigenous, people of color, for LGBTQ persons, for all who are suffering and marginalized in our world. Imagine how we can innovate and how we can shift our culture to live up to such a glorious possibility. As the author of the essay that we heard earlier said, to build a racially and culturally diverse community is to build a world of beauty and power. May we all hear this calling to build a world of beauty and power, because it is the right thing to do.